Welcome to University Place Presents. I'm Norman Gilliland. The late 19th century brought quite a number of really major advances in human well-being. For example, the electric light in the 1870s provided a clean, safe source of illumination. The invention of the automobile did away with all of the disease components associated with horse traffic. And in 1919, of course, prohibition was an attempt to regulate human behavior in a more healthy vein. In 1907, the state of Indiana passed the first state eugenics law, a logical extension perhaps of the foregoing, and in 1913, Wisconsin followed suit. What was the purpose of these laws exactly? How effective were they, and where are they today? Joining me for University Place Presents is Phyllis Reski. She's the author of the article, Policing the Wayward Woman, Eugenics in Wisconsin's Involuntary Sterilization Program, which appeared in the Wisconsin Magazine of History. Welcome to University Place Presents.
Oh, thank you. Good to be here.
So I've mentioned all these wonderful advances,
Yes.
in human health in the late 19th into the early 20th century. A logical extension, eugenics, to police the population's new members?
Yes, it started in the late 19th century. A precursor was social Darwinism, where
I wondered about that.
yes, where we just leave the races alone, and eventually the unfit populations would just die out. Natural selection, it would just happen. And then Sir Francis Galton, he coined the word eugenics, which is in general meaning well-born. He was the cousin of Charles Darwin, and he believed that, no, they're just not, it's not going to happen with social Darwinism, where with natural selection, they're not going to die out. So there needs to be human intervention into it. And so he developed the theory of eugenics, where scientists would intervene in the sake for human betterment.
Of course, the concept goes way back. I mean, Oedipus set out on the hillside because of his defective foot, and a long tradition of that. And of course, speaking of Darwin, going back into the animal kingdom too, mothers, killing defective children and all that. But where do we actually see it consciously practiced under the name of eugenics?
Do you mean in the 19th century, early? Eugenics is, now with this theory of eugenics, what do we do? And, with Sir Francis Galton, what he came out with the eugenic theory, there were family histories that were published. The most famous was a Dr. Dugdale, and he did a study of the Jukes. And this family in New York, and they had a history of promiscuity, criminality, poverty, and it's like if we could curtail the procreation in this family, we would save the state of New York over $1 million.
So is he making any kind of distinction between physiological traits, which might be passed on, and behavioral traits, which may or may not be passed on?
That's a very interesting point with Dr. Robert Dugdale, was that he did believe that with the change of environment, especially the children, we take the children out of that environment and give them an education that they won't turn out like their relatives or their parents.
Okay, that's a far cry from eugenics.
Yes, he did believe in inheritable traits, however, and so, but he said that something can be done when it comes to pulling them out of the environment and educating them. But the people at the time in the late 19th century focused on the inheritable traits. And during that time too, we have like the imperialism, the United States starting to go out in the world and conquer these colonies, these inferior people, and bringing Western civilization to them to prove society in those colonies. And also that we had laissez-faire, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that you have like J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers and the Wallenberg, all these very rich, ostentatious people that, and monopolies forming, and them becoming richer and taking up more and more of the wealth.
Sure.
And that deflection from them, it's like, it's not this capitalism gone amok. It's not us. It's, eugenics gave them a way to say that it's not us, it's these defective people. They're just producing more of their kind. It has nothing to do with the environment. It has nothing to do with capitalism and what's going on in the industrial society and what comes with it.
So pretty quickly, there's a political component to the eugenics debate, assuming there is a debate even at this point.
Yes, and the political debate, yeah, there is, more of the scientists, the upper classes, they're supporting eugenics because, again, it's not, we are, we get the good fruit of capitalism, and so why not? We're the superior class.
The fittest.
And the fittest. And now with eugenics, that's scientifically proven, and we just produce more of our kind. And that's why more of our kind get richer and richer and get more affluent while the poor get poorer, And so that was a really good rationalization for them.
So let's start with Indiana and this law
Yes.
in 1907. What was the purpose of it?
The purpose was to curtail the unfits. And now, with eugenics laws, there wasn't like a federal eugenics laws, except for immigration. And so it depended on the states and what the doctors, the legislatures believed, what they perceived, or what they got out of the eugenic theory. And so for Indiana, it was they focused more on the mental defectives, the criminals. Some states didn't. They didn't focus on the criminals. They just who they deemed as mental defectives, and usually that's the people who are dependent on the states, who got aid from the states, financial support, welfare, the welfare recipients, and the promiscuous people, people who broke like societal transgressions.
Okay, so again, there seem to be sort of two things going on. One of them has to do with behavior.
Yes.
And the other has to do with what we call, defects or, physiological defects. So in this law in Indiana, what are they actually doing to implement it?
They, who they targeted were the inmates in the state institutions who were there, who were diagnosed as insane or having a mental defect. They just call them mental defectives. And for women, like a sexual transgression. They were like a prostitute, or they just had illegitimate children. So there's that sexual transgression, that societal transgression,
Well, they have a whole
Yeah.
set of state prisons, but they're not going there, and they're not assuming that because somebody is a criminal and incarcerated that they would be subject to eugenics. Just the more those considered to be mentally defective somehow.
Yeah. With Indiana, I'm not sure. What I remember is that I think it was like in the prisons, they would go to the prisons and examine some of the prisoners and see if they were deemed mental defectives, and then they would transfer them over to the state institutions.
So now when we get to a nice progressive enlightened state like Wisconsin in 1913, how did that compare in terms of its implementation of eugenics laws?
Well, with Indiana passing the first eugenic sterilization law, then other states followed. And so Wisconsin just, picked up on that trail. And it's like, we should have a law too. And the person who very much wanted a passage of a eugenic sterilization law was Dr. Alfred Wilmarth. He was the first superintendent for the Wisconsin Home for the Feeble-Minded, which that was the name of now is the Northern Wisconsin Center for the Developmentally Disabled.
And what did the law actually say in Wisconsin?
It's any mental defective or epileptic an inmate in the institution, they can undergo the operation.
And they can undergo.
Well,
that
they,
is to
they
say,
should.
And who makes
Yeah.
the decision, and
Well,
is there any kind of a safety valve for that?
Well, what happened was when the law passed, the State Department that oversaw that whole sterilization program was the State Board of Control. And so the State Board of Control, along with the superintendent, Dr. Wilmarth, would compile the list of potential sterilization candidates. And what they did was, of course, look at each case file, but also their family backgrounds. And so they would research their family backgrounds and see if there was any relatives or family members who were either in other state institutions or just a history of welfare, receiving welfare from the state, criminality, yeah.
Did this individual, whether it was a prostitute just picked up last week or an epileptic who might have been institutionalized for a year, have any kind of say or choice in this? Or did this group of experts just make the decision and there was no recourse?
Well, they had very little say in it, of course. Being for themselves, being in a state institution, obviously they couldn't afford a private institution. And so they had very little legal recourse. And part of their procedures is once a person was a candidate for sterilization, they would send a notice to a family member, a relative, or their guardian. And if they don't get any notification back, that was considered consent.
Silence is consent.
Yes. And and if there was a refusal of their ward or their daughter or son to get a sterilization, then they were an inmate of the institution indefinitely.
Oh, so this sterilization was assumed to be then kind of a credential for getting
Very
freed
much
of the
for
institution.
yes,
For dismissal.
for discharge or parole, very much so. So there's that coercion there.
And what do we know about Dr. Wilmarth? Was his motive well-founded, do you think? Because there were a lot of people around at this time, pseudo-experts, who did profit from doing one kind of surgery or another on people.
Well, back then, reputable doctors like Dr. Wilmarth were very much respected in their addresses to medical societies, to legislatures, to women's clubs, to other social clubs. They were believed. They were trusted. They would throw out the statistical numbers. Back then, in regards to eugenics, they weren't under the scrutiny like we are now with research. And so they were readily believed, and maybe in the way they wanted to believe that.
It was a time, of course, of authority figures,
Yes.
really right on through into the 50s probably, that if somebody was purportedly an expert in a field,
Yes.
he or she was credible.
Yes.
That's a kind of this instant credibility we saw, of course, in advertising for years. And Dr. Wilmarth, then he have I want to say confederate, but that's not quite the right word, but he had adherents, he had assistants in this crusade for eugenics.
Oh yes. He was the chief supporter of it. I know that There were at UW Madison, or the Wisconsin State College, I think it was, or the university back then, here in Madison, there were professors who supported eugenics, like E.A. Ross and Charles Van Nuys. So very much in the intellectual circles.
So actually, I mean, the president of the university, Van Nuys,
Yes.
supported eugenics.
Yes.
Well, I think
yeah.
there was also, wasn't there a presidential candidate who
Theodore
supported
Roosevelt, yes.
it? Theodore Roosevelt, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's surprising. Even Helen Keller.
Oh, no, really?
Yes, she supported eugenics. Surprisingly, or shockingly, she supported eugenical euthanasia of mentally challenged babies.
That's
yes.
quite a surprise.
So, and also feminists too, and Marie Stopes, and I think a local suffragist, Ada James.
We're in favor of eugenics.
Yes.
And it's fascinating how
Yes.
it kind of splits out these
Yes.
various factions, as you would think might be antithetical to each other.
Yes, well, even through the 20th century, these people were in the same circles, the same similar organizations, the same organizations. So they talked to each other frequently, probably about eugenics and sterilization, and they had connections to the legislatures. So they had that influence and power. And so if they're going to believe this eugenic theory and say, sterilization, that is a good idea, they could do something with that.
Augustus Byers, was he one of the figures in this also?
Yes, he was the second superintendent of the Home for the Feeble-Minded. He was the assistant superintendent to Dr. Wilmarth, and he also believed in eugenics, and so he just continued the tradition. Now, he started to be the superintendent, I think, in the early 1920s. And that's when the Wisconsin Home for the Feeble-Minded turned from like a custodial institution to, and they even changed the name to the Northern Wisconsin Colony and Training School, and everyone called it the Northern Colony. So instead of lifelong incarceration for these inmates,
it was
right,
a transitional place.
Exactly. And so they were trained in gender acceptable occupations, women for sewing, and then women or men in the wood shop, and making stuff like that, and being paroled in the community to serve the community.
This is an interesting bit of, I want to call it propaganda, but I'm not sure that's quite the right word, in describing the concept behind eugenics. This tree that shows that with eugenics you can kind of guide the development of the branches of the human race.
Yes, and it's very much interdisciplinary. You have the genetics, so you have the science, you have the sociological factors, you have the medical factors, so you have all these other different branches too coming together. And then as they're working together, out comes this wonderful tree, with the betterment of society. So, and that was a logo for the Second Eugenics Congress that was held in, I think it was in New England, and that was in like 1912. And so this was very much a popular movement. And so they had these national congresses and stuff like that, where they came together from all over the world and talked about eugenics.
Are they really, when we're talking about eugenics, is really the main thrust of it just sterilization, or were there other components to it?
The method that they really supported was sterilization. At first it was segregation. There were three main ways, actually. It was segregation, eugenic marriage laws, and sterilization.
Eugenic marriage laws.
Yes.
Okay. Would that be where you'd have to prove?
Yes, you have to prove that you're fit. You're healthy in order to marry. Yes, and so in Wisconsin, they first started with segregation, and Dr. Wilmarth was realizing that we can't take who we deem mentally or unfit and just stick them in institutions. It would just be too many people. And then the cost to the state would be too much, of course. And so we can't do that. And so the second was the enactment of a eugenic marriage law in Wisconsin. And I think that was around the same time. I think it was 1910. That was before the sterilization law. But then there's this belief that the people who propagated more of their kind, the unfit, they didn't marry. And so there was a lot of out-of-wedlock births. And so you're not really curtailing the unfit by, so they're seeing the, they were perceiving that as illogical. And so...
the eugenics marriage proponents.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And so, and that was, actually there was that was overturned, that law was overturned by the state Supreme Court.
Really? And what was the basis?
The basis was...
because this could, you're going to pertain on the whole outcome of the eugenics thing in general if we get into any court challenges later on.
Yes. And it was struck down. It just wasn't... some legislatures were saying that, doctors, they're just making money off of it.
Right, that would be, that would be an understandable belief.
Yes, and so eugenicists and eugenic supporters really support sterilization because, looking at it, the program where you admit so many people into the institution, sterilize them, and then parole them, you can get new admits, and most of them are good eugenic or sterilization candidates. You can sterilize them and then get them out into the community. And so you have this program where they come in, but they go out.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this northern colony was where?
In Chippewa Falls.
Chippewa Falls. And it was established when?
1897, very much an isolated part of Wisconsin. It still is. I did visit there several years ago, and some of the old buildings are still standing. But it was very much a colony. It was very much its own village and isolated from the world. But that was the attitude towards developmentally disabled people at the time, out of sight, out of mind.
And just to skip ahead briefly, though, so the focus of it, the northern colony, has changed, obviously, from eugenics to some other form of transition into society.
Yes. In contemporary times now, they take on more severe physically disabled clients. Yes.
Let's look at the kind of the social fabric that was being addressed by these eugenic laws in Wisconsin in the 19-teens. We talk about people who were sexually promiscuous.
Yes.
Primarily women.
Yes.
Was the concern because they were the ones who would be having children, but was there a male component to this concern also?
Well, the male component was that they had more rights. They could probably assert themselves more in getting legal protection instead of the woman. The most vulnerable back at that time was the sexually promiscuous woman who would fall out of favor of society, and so they were very much more vulnerable to sterilization than
I suppose harder to prove promiscuity with the man anyway if he doesn't stick around.
Yes, yes.
We have here a party scene. This is, I believe, Milwaukee, 1914.
Yes.
And would this group of people be candidates for the kind of eugenics we've been talking about?
Yes.
And why would that be?
I remember one case in particular where a woman was admitted to the Northern Colony partly because she was caught in a saloon with a man. And you picture a woman in this dance hall back then, and they weren't they wouldn't be looked at as very pious women.
Right.
And so, in that particular county, I think that was south of Milwaukee in Racine County. She was arrested and she was incarcerated at the Northern Colony.
Oh, okay. And what was she arrested for?
She was caught with a man in a saloon, and that she had
children necessarily out of wedlock. Not,
as far as
selling sex.
No, but back then in a saloon or a dance hall, that was very much where people saw women being confronted with their own downfall, selling themselves. And so,
or giving themselves away.
Right. And so being caught with a man in a saloon, that could have went both ways there, prostitution or just giving oneself away.
Right.
And,
so it was considered kind of preemptive in this case, which makes you wonder a little bit about how preemptive they could get with a eugenics law. Somebody's just in a situation where they might have this downfall.
Oh yeah, and they might have the downfall, or they committed it. I remember case studies where there was one woman who was admitted and then sterilized. She was caught for prostitution. Women who had illegitimate children, and also the family history. They had family members who were committed or receiving welfare from the state. These were, and for some of these women, they were assaulted, or raped, or they were incarcerated. Well, the men may have gotten parole or may have gotten jail time, but then sooner or later they would be released.
Which is reason why I'm kind of amazed that the suffragists would support these laws. They're so unfair.
Yes, and it's also, one of my professors said that class trumps gender. And these women, these suffragists, and other women too, they were from the upper and middle to upper classes. And so they supported eugenics too, even though they were of the same gender. It's like, well, I'm keeping my piety. Why aren't they? Or, something like that.
Yes.
They must be defective. That was the attitude.
Why can't they?
Right. They must be defective. Why would you give yourself away? Why would you prostitute? There's something wrong mentally with you.
And so something as simple as one instance of being apprehended in a saloon with a man would get an individual into this northern colony automatically subject to sterilization?
Unfortunately, there was women from other institutions who were transferred to the northern colony to get sterilized. So some of these women were in institutions for a number of years. Lived in their young lives an institutionalized life, and with that, they have to go before the judge because the judge can. They're the only ones who can order their incarceration.
Right.
And so they can go before the judge and have the witnesses come forward and she did this, she did that, and according to where she was in her community, her status. Maybe she was a woman of bad repute. That the judge can, and it depended on the judge on whether or not they knew of this program, and probably most of them did. Women were incarcerated or admitted from all over the state, and so it's like this is where you need to be. I'm going to send you to the northern colony.
So let's follow this, and it's not hypothetical, but we don't necessarily know everything about her subsequent history.
Yeah.
But this woman arrested for being in a saloon with a man,
right?
So we'll say 1914 or so, and sentenced to incarceration by a judge. And then somebody decides that she should go to the northern colony.
Right, and so she's transferred to the northern colony from probably the county jail. And once she is there, they do examine her. They are given an intelligence test, and then they are put into or placed into a cottage. And then what happens then if they are a candidate for sterilization, how that's determined is the sterilization committee and that is made up of the superintendents, the alienist, which was, well, now we call him a psychiatrist,
Alienist.
and yes, and a medical doctor. And so they would look at the case and probably interview her. And so for a woman to go before a judge and having this exposed or whatever, and then having this shame, this past coming up again for her, and then losing one's fertility, it was just what the women went through.
But
yes.
she would have to, though, she would have to go through the sterilization in order to get out of the colony, in order to be released.
Yes, and so, yeah.
It kind of reminds me of the way the Humane Society is today. But then how long would she be in this colony typically? Sterilized or otherwise?
The average time, I did calculate the average time of, and it was, I think it was 5 to 10 years.
5 to 10 years?
Yes. And
whether she'd been sterilized or not?
Well,
or how did that work?
The thing is, the average age of sterilization was 21 years old for a woman, and so they could be sterilized, and that was in the admission books that I examined. They would have the date of the sterilization, and then they would stay for a period of time and then be paroled or discharged, or some of them escaped, and then so many years later, it could be that someone just enters into that admission book discharged from the State Board of Control. So whether that was an actual discharge or they just wrote it in just to close the case, who knows?
What was the actual sterilization procedure? We have, this operating room scene here.
Yes.
What did they actually do?
It was called salpingectomy.
Salpingectomy.
Yes. And that was the cutting of the fallopian tubes, I believe it was. Yes, that was the main method.
And it would have been irreversible.
Right.
Well, okay, so 5 to 10 years in this northern colony.
Yes.
Well, and was it, there was a mix of genders at this colony? Or
yes, it was.
Uh-huh.
It was, for the most part, an equal number of men and an equal number of women who were at the colony.
All right, so what did they do for their 5 to 10 years?
Well, they they did according to what society would have men and women do. Men were in the workshop, and they would be trained to do woodwork, or trained to repair shoes, or work in agricultural, because they had their own farm there too at the institution, and so they would be doing that. And so the women would be in home domesticity, where they would be trained to wait tables, or they would be trained to wash dishes and to cook, to sew.
Regardless of what their profession may have been before they went in, they were just kind of funneled through this sort of job training program.
Yes. Especially that really took off in the 1920s with Dr. Beyer. He very much believed in that type of rehabilitation.
Do we have a sense of, like any case studies in terms of how these people did after they were released from the northern colony? I mean, was this something that they would have on their resume, that would make it perhaps more difficult for them to get employment?
I think they were placed, I have read that they were placed in different areas of employment, but very much once they were paroled or discharged, they didn't check up on them. They didn't keep track with them. They didn't. And throughout this research, I found very little voice on account of the inmates' part.
Really? There really wasn't any record, any memoirs, any letters from
I could find. No
inmates, if we can call them that.
Well, there was one that I found where a woman was sterilized. She was discharged, and I think it was in the 1940s, and this was maybe 10 to 15 years later. she got married during that time, and she wrote a letter back to the Northern Colony, and it's like, I think I was sterilized. I'm married now, and I wanted to have children, and but I can't, and I wanted to know exactly what happened when I was there.
Oh, to know whether
Yes.
it could be reversed or not.
Yeah, and it was just, and go back a little bit. She was from the Southern Colony, and so there was a Southern Colony in Union Grove, and they also transferred their inmates to the Northern Colony to be sterilized, and then they would be transferred back, and then eventually be discharged or paroled. And and she was a Southern Colony inmate, and so, but because she was sterilized at the Northern Colony, she wrote to the superintendent of the Northern Colony, and the superintendent's response was, how I interpret as rather terse, was, you were a Southern Colony inmate, you need to write to them. Thank you.
Even though it was done up here.
Yes. Yeah, you need to write to them about this. Sincerely. And that was it. And I did look up that particular patient, that they did have records of her sterilization. They could have given her information, and for whatever reason, he just decided not to deal with it.
We have some, I'll call them domestic scenes here from the Northern Colony,
Yes.
and some of the occupational training. This, again, let's see, represents probably some occupational training for men that we're looking at here, or
We are
getting
looking at
into-
women who are being trained in sewing. That was the sewing room.
sewing, right.
Very much a women's world back then. That was a culturally appropriate thing for a woman to be trained in, and so that's how they were. Instead of transgressing against society by being promiscuous or being free in that way, whatever they wanted to do, it's like, no, you can't do that, and you have to do this. This is what women do.
This is another scene that would
Yes.
be exactly what you'd expect, actually,
Right.
for a job training for
Yes.
women at this time, this kind of the kitchen work.
Yeah, kitchen work, very much so.
Then there's another one here, too, which
And that
is
was-
similar.
Yeah, and that was serving people. If they were going to be a waitress, or if they were in somebody's home and they would be serving them.
Do we have a sense of totals? How many people were sterilized in Wisconsin over what period of time?
Well, that's interesting because I didn't find a consistent number. I know it was over 1,800 people, and about 80% of them were women.
We still have very little record, though, of what became of these people and what the experience was like for them.
Yes.
Here's one more occupational
And that would be,
scene.
yeah, and I know the previous picture was sewing. This is more needlework too, that they could do and sell or work for somebody else, and they would know that precise needlework to do that.
Do you have a sense, Phyllis, of how many states, by the time we're full force in Wisconsin with eugenics, how many other states had laws, similar ones?
Up to about 30 states had eugenic sterilization laws. Yes, and California sterilized over the 20th century over 20,000 men and women. They were number one in total sterilizations, and Wisconsin is ranked 8th.
And this goes out till what period of time this goes on?
Well, the majority of eugenic sterilization laws, most of them were repealed in the 1970s. Most of the states stopped sterilizing men and women in 1963. And
Specifically that date, why?
that year, yeah. That was very peculiar. And it's like, okay, why all of a sudden in 1963? Unfortunately, I never found that document that said we stopped sterilization or because.
But the repeals of the laws? There must be some documentation for that.
For epileptics, I know that the sterilization law of Wisconsin, when it came to epileptics, that was repealed in 1955. Of course, they had the medical studies that came out.
Right.
That this isn't genetic, and it's treatable now. and they can live productive lives. And so that was repelled. And yeah, a couple of factors that I found. One was that now medical authorities like the American Medical Association and the American Neurological Association came out with years worth of studies, and this started in the 1950s to the early 1960s. They were publishing these studies where mental defectiveness wasn't inheritable. There's no real solid evidence of this, and they were questioning the legality of doing this.
Well, I was wondering about that,
yes.
and this came up earlier in our conversation, this reference to possible court cases. You would think with these laws on the books from 1907, 1913, for decades, that there would have been some.
Well, there was the Buck versus Bell. That is the famous United States Supreme Court case where the sterilization law was that in West Virginia, that Carrie Buck was sterilized, and then after that happened, she brought suit against the state, and eventually went to the states or the United States Supreme Court, and they upheld the sterilization law.
Oh, did they?
Yes, they did.
And what was the
Because,
reasoning?
well, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, that famous quote, three imbeciles, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And so you had legislatures here, you had judges here, and judges in other states that supported eugenics. Well, you had the state supreme or the United States Supreme Court upholding that too, and they believed in the eugenic theory back then, and that was in the late 1920s. And so after that, there was a spike in sterilizations, because this is constitutional or
protected by the U.S. Constitution.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and but in Wisconsin, it did rise, but not to a point. It seemed like they wanted to be under the radar and not get too much attention with what they were doing because of the liability factor. And they wanted to protect the physicians who were performing the sterilizations too.
Was there any kind of, as we get later into this process of sterilization, was there any kind of political consciousness, social consciousness, movement that would say, we already know that the science was no good. That
right.
comes out later. But what about just the whole ethics of it? Is that questioned in any kind of systematic way?
The ethics of that, yes, because if studies are showing that this, eugenic theory, it's just it's going to be disputed, or it's not, it's pseudoscience, then the ethics, the coercion, you can't be discharged unless you're sterilized, that very much is going to be questioned. And that was even more so in the 1960s, in this state with Frederick Kessler, our representative that introduced a law to repel the sterilization law. And it just, I found it surprising that back then it was the State Board of Control, and I think it was like the State Department of Public Welfare, or I can't remember, that all the name changes, but they really fought that. It was in the legislature for a long time to repel that law, and it seemed like they were holding on to the fact that this, what they were doing was right, or what, being ethical and defending themselves.
I would suppose, science notwithstanding, it would be hard to demonstrate a return on this kind of investment in terms of how can you demonstrate that society is somehow better for having sterilized all these people.
And I wrote that at the end of my article. It hasn't been proven. There weren't. It's not like they went back. It's like, okay, it has the human gene pool improved because of this, So it's like, why have this program in the first place?
There must be still some thousands of people in Wisconsin, hundreds of people, at least in Wisconsin, who went through this process, and they're
still alive.
Not talking about it.
No, after the publication of the article, I didn't hear of anyone like coming forward to say anything. Especially with there was some, a lot of national attention at the time in North Carolina, where especially African Americans came forward and said that we were sterilized, we were coerced, back in the 1950s and into the 1960s, and that they wanted. I can't think of the right word, but some sort of
restitution.
Restitution, yes, restitution from the state of North Carolina.
Have all the states, then, all these 30 states, repealed the laws by now?
I'm not sure about that. I know that some states have, of course, North Carolina, Indiana, Wisconsin. I would think they would have. Yeah.
Probably a chapter that's
Yes.
pretty well closed in
Yes.
American health history.
Very much so.
Well, Phyllis Reske, thank you for joining me for University Place Presents.
Oh,
and,
thank you
telling
very
us about
much.
this chapter of Wisconsin history.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me.
I'm Norman Gilliland, and I hope you can join me next time around for University Place Presents.